Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that smells faintly of salt water, stale smoke, and the faint metallic tang of coins rubbing together in some merchant's palm. You're standing at the edge of a colonial dock, maybe in Bombay, maybe in Hong Kong, maybe in Singapore, it hardly matters. The air is heavy, not just with humidity, but with that strange haze that comes from thousands of pipes burning the same plant resin night after night. You can practically taste it on your tongue before you even set foot down the gangplank. You probably won't survive this place, not because anyone's swinging swords or firing muskets, but because the sheer atmosphere might lull you to sleep, faster than your blanket tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time. It is there. I always love seeing the little constellation of night owls scattered around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The dockside haze isn't just poetic description, it's literal. The great opium trade of the 19th century made these ports into hubs of both wealth and despair. Ships from Britain's East India Company offload crates that reek faintly of dried poppy resin, a cargo so valuable it could balance an empire's finances. You hear the creak of timbers, the splash of water as small boats bob against the quay, and the faint shouts in a dozen different languages. Sailors, porters, merchants, and officials, each scrambling to keep the machinery of empire turning. You trudge past stacked barrels of tea leaves and boxes stamped with British crests yet the real treasure lies in plain wooden crates marked with discreet symbols. Inside, those are bricks of processed opium, wrapped in oil-soaked paper to preserve them on their long voyages. Some historians still argue whether the British Crown turned a blind eye or fully orchestrated the trade, but the fact remains, without these sticky brown blocks, half the empire's revenues would have gone up in smoke, literally. A fringe tidbit you probably didn't expect, the very ropes tying down those crates were often soaked with seawater during the journey, and when left in humid warehouses, rats would gnaw on them, intoxicated by the faint traces of opium powder clinging to the fibers. Imagine stumbling onto a port full of very relaxed, suspiciously sleepy rats. That's one version of pest control no manual ever recommended. The dockside is chaos, but it has its rhythms. Local labourers haul cargo with shoulders slick from sweat, their bare feet slapping against wood planks. Overseers bark commands, clipboards in hand, pretending their orders make the work go faster. British merchants in stiff coats dab their foreheads with handkerchiefs and smile too broadly, already calculating the profits that will line their ledgers once this shipment is sold. For them, opium isn't a vice or a tragedy, it's a commodity. No different than sugar or cotton. You, standing here, can see both sides at once, the weary human bodies expending themselves for pennies and the finely dressed men eager to buy mansions in Kensington. Every so often, the smoke curls thick even this far from the dens. That's because opium is consumed almost everywhere near the docks. Makeshift shelters built from tarps, broken warehouses turned into temporary dens, even small boats anchored offshore where crews gather at night. You notice bodies lying on their sides, heads tipped back, eyes glassy with the half-lidded days of intoxication. Some stir, some do not. Dock authorities rarely check too closely. If someone doesn't wake up with the tide, there's always another labourer to take his place. The strangest detail is how normal it all feels here. You walk past what looks like a man sleeping off an exhausting shift, but when you glance again, the stillness is too absolute. The chest doesn't rise. The flies arrive before anyone bothers to move him. Yet, just beyond, a food vendor shouts cheerily, selling fried fish skewers and sweet cakes to sailors. Life and death share the same plank walkway without pause, as if the empire has trained everyone to accept both as background noise. And then there's the smell. You've got brine, coal smoke from steamers, human sweat, exotic spices, cloves, cinnamon, peppercorns, plus the unmistakable sweet-sour tang of opium smoke. If you've ever walked past a burnt sugar stand at a fair and thought, that's oddly pleasant but also choking, you're halfway there. Only here, the scent clings to everything. your clothes, your hair, even the parchment of shipping. Ledgers in office drawers. It's no wonder that some colonial officials complained that they couldn't sleep without thinking the air itself was drugging them. Some modern historians like to debate whether the so-called Streets of Opium Corpses were exaggerated by missionaries to scare the home audience. After all, photographs from the time often show bustling marketplaces, smiling merchants, lively families. But dig deeper into diaries and reports, and you find passages about early morning corpse collection, about the hush that fell whenever someone collapsed in the street, about the quiet deals struck between dockside policemen and den owners. The empire presented order by day, but you, standing here at dawn, see the truth washing up with the tide. And still, the business grows. Cargo after cargo, coin after coin, ledger after ledger. You're caught in that foggy moment where moral judgment collides with weary acceptance. The docks themselves seem to exhale, a giant lung puffing out clouds of opium smoke that drift into every alley of the colonial city. As you walk away from the harbor, the haze thickens, and you realize this is just the beginning. You wander deeper into the alleys that snake away from the docks, and the smoke only thickens like a fog that refuses to lift. The buildings here lean into each other as though conspiring, their wooden shutters warped by years of damp air, their paint peeling in faded layers of colonial ambition. A stray dog darts past your ankles, thin ribs heaving, tail tucked, nose twitching toward some unseen morsel. It pauses at the entrance of one narrow lane where the air is sweet, cloying, unmistakable. This is where the opium dens begin. You hesitate because the doorway looks more like a laundry storeroom than a den of indulgence. A ragged cloth hangs as a curtain, barely concealing the faint orange glow inside. Slip past, and you're immediately engulfed in the thick perfume of burning resin. A dozen oil lamps flicker on low shelves, their flames focused beneath tiny bowls where pellets of opium bubble and darken, releasing curls of smoke that drift lazily into the rafters. The whole place feels like a dream sequence filmed before cameras even existed. Sailors lie sprawled on straw mats, shoes kicked off, caps tossed aside. Locals recline with pipes resting gently between their fingers, eyes glazed in that half-conscious trance that looks peaceful but feels more like surrender. The floor is sticky in patches, though you'd rather not guess what mixture of spilled tea, lamp oil, and human sweat produced it. A man hums a tune that may be Chinese or Malay or something invented on the spot. It doesn't matter because his voice is drowned in the steady cough of someone else exhaling thick plumes. Mainstream fact. Opium dens like these weren't hidden from public view as you might imagine. In many colonial ports, they were tolerated as semi-official establishments, sometimes even taxed by local authorities. They could be found as easily as a tavern or tea house, their lanterns often painted with discreet motifs, lotus flowers, crescent moons, or the simple character for smoke. But here's a quirky tidbit. Dens often doubled as informal pawn shops. Addicts who ran out of coins would hand over a belt buckle, a pair of boots, even an old love letter with a nice wax seal, just for a few more pellets of opium. Some dens reportedly displayed a wall of mismatched shoes, left behind by men who stumbled out barefoot, never to return. You crouch down beside one of the sailors, his pipe resting on a carved ivory stand. His lips twitch as though forming words, but only a faint murmur escapes, something about home. Maybe Liverpool, maybe Calcutta, maybe a place that exists only in his smoke-clouded head. You wonder how many stories lie trapped in this room, how many confessions are whispered and immediately forgotten. The den keeper is a wiry man with a sparse beard and eyes that dart constantly to the door. He wears a long robe patched in places, yet his hands are surprisingly clean, nails trimmed, pipe tools polished. He's the conductor of this sleepy orchestra, tending to lamps, refilling bowls, occasionally shooing away a drunk who strayed from rum to resin. You catch his glance. It isn't hostile, but calculating. He's measuring whether you're here to buy, to spy, or to steal. Historians still argue whether dens like this represented cultural exchange or exploitation. Some say they were places where Chinese immigrants and European sailors mingled freely, bonded by a common escape from harsh labor. Others argue they were traps, deliberately cultivated by merchants to keep workers docile, spending their wages on smoke instead of food or protest. The truth, as usual, lingers somewhere in the haze. One sailor sits up suddenly and gestures as if catching something in the air, laughing to himself. Nobody else reacts. You realize quickly that laughter here is both rare and unnerving. It cuts against the gentle rhythm of sighs and coughs. Then, just as quickly, he collapses again, the pipe slipping from his fingers. The den keeper scoops it up before it rolls too far. Business is business. You lean against the wall, the wood warm from years of oil lamps burning close. The faint soot marks trace a history of thousands of bowls smoked, thousands of souls who reclined right where you are now. And you wonder, just briefly, how many left this place to stumble into the street, only to collapse for good a few steps later. The phrase, "Streets of Opium Corpses," no longer feels like some moralist exaggeration. It feels like a logical next step once you've seen the haze settle in their lungs. For all its decay, the den has its strange allure. You understand why people come: the cramped space, the flickering lamps, the hypnotic rhythm of preparing the pipe, the promise of slipping into a world where the weight of empire, labor, and hunger dissolves. It's an escape hatch built into the alleys of colonial cities, a ticket you pay with coins, dignity, or life expectancy. And yet outside, the night continues. You hear laughter from a tavern 2 doors down, the clink of glasses, a fiddle scraping out a dance tune. Somewhere else, a church bell tolls softly, marking the hour with an almost ironic piety. The den keeper lights another lamp. The sailor exhales another cloud, and the street itself seems to breathe with them. The haze drifts out the doorway, curling into the dark, where the next alley waits. You drift further inland, away from the flickering doorways of the dens and deeper into the neighborhoods where colonial laborers sleep, if they sleep at all. The docks behind you are noisy, but here the streets grow quieter, broken only by the shuffle of bare feet and the distant wheeze of steam engines still unloading goods. Lanterns swing gently from crooked posts, casting yellow circles of light that don't quite push back the shadows. This is where you find the quarters of the Chinese laborers, the men who work themselves hollow during the day only to find solace in a pipe when the sun goes down. Their lives are stitched into the empire's fabric, though most never saw. Beyond the plantation fields, the railroad tracks, or the cramped ship holds where they began. Many were brought under contracts so unfair they bordered on slavery, with wages that vanished into fees for food, lodging, and endless deductions. After 12 hours swinging picks or bending over rows of sugarcane, the body aches in ways you don't even have names for. And so, when the shift ends, the men gather in shared dormitories where someone always has a pipe warming. A mainstream fact. In many colonies, the majority of the laboring workforce on infrastructure projects, railways, in Malaya, tin mines in Burma, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, was made up of Chinese migrants recruited under systems of indenture. These men became the backbone of colonial economies, yet their escape from exhaustion often came through the haze of opium. Picture the dormitory, a long room, wooden planks for walls, a thatched roof that leaks whenever rainstorms sweep through. Inside, rows of mats are lined up side by side, each one occupied by a man lying on his side with a pipe. The air is thick, hotter inside than outside, because the smoke has no place to escape. You feel the heaviness in your lungs after just a moment, and you wonder how they can still breathe, much less rise the next morning to repeat the cycle. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you. Pipes weren't always just pipes. In some labor camps, workers carved their smoking implements from whatever scraps they found: a piece of bamboo, a hollowed-out tool handle, even the leg of a broken stool. One missionary reported finding a pipe made from a child's toy drumstick. That mix of desperation and ingenuity would be almost admirable if it weren't such a bleak reflection of their reality. You crouch down beside one group sharing a single lamp. The ritual is precise, almost sacred. A pea-sized ball of opium resin is rolled between calloused fingers, then placed carefully in the bowl. The lamp's flame licks it into bubbling, and the smoke is drawn slowly through the pipe. Each man inhales deeply, holds the breath, and then exhales with a sigh that sounds less like relaxation and more like resignation. The sighs rise together, like a mournful choir. Historians still argue whether opium offered these workers genuine relief or merely chained them tighter to the system. Some say the drug dulled their pain enough to survive one more day, giving them agency in choosing oblivion over despair. Others argue it kept them docile, easier to control, their wages flowing back into the colonial coffers through state-sanctioned opium sales. Whichever version you choose, the sight is the same. Rows of men drifting into semi-consciousness, their lives spent in smoke before they ever had a chance to spend them in freedom. One man hums softly as he smokes, a tune that seems almost like a lullaby. Maybe it's for himself, maybe it's for the memory of family left behind in Canton or Fujian. Many of these workers sent money home when they had any left. But the irony you can't escape is that the very empire paying their wages also sold them the pipe that devoured those wages. You think of it as a cruel loop. Money earned, money smoked, money returned to the very hands that held the whip. Step outside for a moment, and the street itself reflects their exhaustion. You see men collapsed on wooden benches, heads resting. On their arms, smoke drifting lazily above them. Some stir when you pass, blinking with red-rimmed eyes, as though trying to recall where they are. Others don't move at all. A child, barefoot, wide-eyed, tugs at the sleeve of one sleeper, maybe a father, maybe just a stranger, but there's no response. The boy scampers away, disappearing into the night like a ghost. You pause to think how ordinary this has become. The empire records their names only on contracts and shipping lists, never in history books. Yet here they are, sprawled across the streets of Singapore or Calcutta, anonymous casualties of an addiction they didn't invent but inherited from the gears of commerce. You can't help noticing how the haze feels heavier the longer you stay. Less like smoke, more like a fog that clings to your thoughts. And just when you think it's silent, a sudden burst of laughter erupts from a nearby shack. A handful of workers play cards by candlelight, their eyes glassy but their hands fast. They argue over rules, slam cards on the floor, and laugh too loudly at jokes you don't understand. For a brief moment, the haze doesn't erase them. It amplifies their humanity. Even here, in a street that reeks of exhaustion and despair, they find a pocket of joy, however fleeting. The laughter fades, the smoke lingers, and you move on. The alleys stretch ahead, each one promising more pipes, more sighs, more bodies curled into the haze. And you realize with a chill that the streets themselves are part of the den. There is no inside or outside, only a colony breathing in rhythm with its own addiction. The streets curve back toward the waterfront, and soon you're standing before a different world altogether, not the cramped dormitories of laborers, but the offices and counting houses of the British merchants. Their windows gleam with polished glass, their doors are framed in brass handles, and their names are painted in bold serif letters that look more at home on a London street than in a humid colonial port. The air here smells less of sweat and resin and more of ink, ledgers, and imported tobacco. And yet, behind all the respectability, the same brown bricks of opium are quietly piling up in warehouses. You picture one of these merchants at his desk, waistcoat buttoned tightly despite the heat, quill scratching neat columns of numbers, candlelight glinting off a brass inkstand. He sighs dramatically when speaking of the hardships of colonial business, but if you glance at the ledger, you see the reality. Profits soaring with each shipload of opium unloaded at the dock. He'll never step inside a den, never inhale the bitter smoke, but he knows that every coin he counts has passed through the lungs of someone lying on a mat. A mainstream fact, the opium trade was one of the most profitable enterprises of the British Empire during the 19th century, especially after the East India Company lost its monopoly on Chinese trade in 1834. British merchants filled the gap eagerly, and by the 1850s, opium exports from India to China were worth millions of pounds annually. That flow of wealth also reached colonial ports across Asia, where sales were tolerated, or even licensed, by local governments. Now, here's a quirky tidbit you might not expect. Some British traders deliberately disguised their opium shipments. by packing them in crates labeled fine biscuits or machine parts. There are accounts of entire warehouses where the biscuits were never eaten and the machine parts never assembled, yet somehow every crate smelled faintly sweet. Imagine opening a tin of biscuits only to find a sticky block of resin inside. Not exactly tea time appropriate. You stroll past one of the counting houses and you notice how quiet it is compared to the clamorous streets you've just left. The merchants like their silence, their air of superiority, their illusion that they are apart from the dirtier realities of empire. But if you step into the back alley, you'll find wagons waiting, stacked with crates, ready to be rolled discreetly toward the neighborhoods where the dens operate. The merchants never see the corpses collected at dawn. They see only numbers, columns that always add up. Historians still argue whether Britain's ruling elite understood the human toll of this trade or whether they simply didn't care. Some evidence suggests Parliament was flooded with petitions from missionaries describing the corpses in colonial streets, yet prophets spoke louder than conscience. Others argue that politicians believed they were delivering commerce and civilization, while conveniently ignoring the haze of despair that came with it. You can decide for yourself, but standing here, you can practically hear the clink of coins outweighing the cries of the dying. Inside one office, a portrait of Queen Victoria hangs proudly above the desk, her stern gaze overlooking every transaction. The irony is almost comedic. The Queen who embodied Victorian morality, sobriety, discipline, family virtue, also reigned over an empire financed in part by selling narcotics abroad. If hypocrisy had a smell, you'd imagine it mixing nicely, with the faint aroma of lamp oil and pipe smoke drifting through the window shutters. The merchants themselves liked to play up their role as gentlemen traders. They sponsored cricket matches, hosted dinner parties, and donated to church funds, all while their ships sailed in and out, carrying the very product filling the gutters with bodies. One traveller noted that these men could quote Shakespeare at a banquet and then, the next morning, negotiate down the price of a shipment that would supply 10 dens for a month. High culture in the dining hall, low culture in the balance sheet, and yet, every now and then, a flicker of doubt appears. In private letters, some merchants confessed unease at seeing addicted workers staggering through the alleys. One wrote, "I sometimes wonder if we traffic in souls, though I must confess the profit numbs my scruples." That's about as close to guilt as you'll find in the records. Most simply kept the quill moving, the ships sailing, the coins flowing. You step back into the street and the contrast slaps you again. On one side, polished windows and perfumed parlors. On the other, the haze of dens and the bodies of men who never had a chance to polish anything but their pipes. The two worlds exist side by side, separated by nothing but the thickness of a wall, or perhaps by the thickness of a conscience. You keep walking, the polished storefronts fading, the warehouses looming larger. Somewhere behind one of those, doors, crates are being shifted, ledgers balanced, and fortunes sealed. And you know that tomorrow morning, when the corpses are carted away from the alleys, the merchants will sip their tea, fold their newspapers, and nod approvingly at the each day's profits. The empire rolls on, smoke in its lungs and coins in its pockets. You leave behind the gleaming windows of the counting houses and step toward a part of the city where the air feels heavier, not just with smoke, but with the weight of words. The narrow lanes echo with voices raised not in drunken songs, but in sermons, laments, and moral pleas. This is where the missionaries live, tucked into modest stone chapels and wooden houses that look out of place amid the shop houses and warehouses. By day, they ring bells and hand out tracts. By night, they walk the same streets you've just crossed, clutching small oil lamps as they stop to kneel beside men lying motionless in the gutter. The missionaries wrote about these streets more than anyone else, which means much of what we know comes filtered through their shocked and sorrowful eyes. They described, often in lurid detail, the streets of opium corpses, bodies curled in doorways, collapsed under market stalls, sprawled across temple steps. They believed their duty was to save souls, and to save them, they first had to describe the depths into which those souls had sunk. If you read their pamphlets today, you can almost hear the quills scratching faster as they tried to capture both outrage and pity. Mainstream fact, Missionary societies in the 19th century played a major role in shaping public opinion about opium back in Britain. Their reports were read aloud in churches, printed in newspapers, and even presented before Parliament. Without them, the British public might never have connected their nation's trade policies to the emaciated figures lying in colonial streets. And yet, here's a quirky tidbit. Some missionaries learned to carry little bottles of smelling salts when they walked their evening rounds. Not because they fainted at the sight of corpses, though they sometimes did, but because the opium haze was so thick that after an hour or two, even the preachers found themselves lightheaded. Picture a stern clergyman wagging a finger at an addict, only to suddenly stumble and sniff his salts before resuming his lecture. Holiness meets slapstick. You follow one of these missionaries now, his thin frame wrapped in a black coat despite the tropical heat. He pauses beside a young man sprawled against a wall, eyes half shut, chest rising shallowly. The missionary kneels, murmurs a prayer, then checks for breath with a trembling hand. This time the man is still alive. But just down the alley, another figure lies too still, too pale. The missionary signals to a pair of helpers, and together they lift the body onto a rough cart. The corpse will be wheeled away before sunrise, buried in a pauper's grave, or consigned to some unmarked plot. Historians still argue whether the missionaries exaggerated these scenes to stir sympathy, or donations back home. Some point out that their descriptions verge on theatrical, painting the colonies as endless wastelands of smoke and despair. Others argue that even if the numbers were inflated, the human suffering was undeniable. You stand here watching, and the debate feels irrelevant. One body is enough to make the point. Inside the chapels, the sermons resound against wooden rafters. The wages of sin is death, a preacher declares, voice trembling with conviction. But if you listen closely, you can hear the fatigue beneath the words. Even the missionaries know that moral lectures can't compete with the soothing pull of a pipe after 16 hours in the fields. Their frustration seeps into their laments. They curse the merchants, plead with the addicts, and beg their congregations back home to write letters of protest. Sometimes they even light candles in memory of those who died nameless in the alleys. A tiny act of dignity amid a tide of oblivion. One fringe missionary even attempted a different approach. Instead of condemning opium, he tried to open a safe den, where small doses were given under supervision with clean mats and fresh water. His idea was to wean men off slowly, replacing haze with habit. The experiment didn't last long, funds dried up and authorities were suspicious, but it left behind a fascinating anecdote of compassion colliding with practicality. As you wander out of the chapel, the streets are quiet again. The carts, with bodies, creak toward the outskirts, their wheels rattling on cobblestones. A lantern flickers in the distance, carried by another missionary making his rounds. The night is thick with smoke, thicker still with unanswered prayers. And in the morning, when the bells toll for service, the missionaries will stand again in their pulpits, recounting the night's sorrows to a weary flock. The congregation will nod, murmuring, "Amen," while outside, the dens open once more, pipes are lit again, and the cycle repeats as if no sermon had ever been spoken. You move past the stone chapels and lamplit alleys of the missionaries, following the curve of a broad avenue where the air grows quieter, the buildings taller, the shutters freshly painted. Here is where the colonial elite live, the wealthy landowners, the local princes who sided with the empire, and the merchants whose ledgers fattened with every crate of poppy resin. Their houses rise behind wrought iron gates, with gardens that look suspiciously thirsty in this tropical heat, watered daily by servants carrying buckets from the same wells that workers drink from. At first glance, it seems like another world entirely. The lawns are trimmed, the verandas wide, the chandeliers, inside, glimmer through tall windows. You could almost believe the haze of the opium dens hasn't seeped this far, until you notice the small signs. A ledger tucked under a folded newspaper, an official decree tacked discreetly to a gatepost, a servant whispering about new taxes, collected. Because even here, amid the silk curtains and imported wines, opium money flows quietly beneath the polished floors. A mainstream fact. In many colonies, local elites, whether Indian Maharajas, Malay sultans, or Chinese businessmen, were given a share of opium revenue through licensing systems and taxation. This wasn't just tolerated, it was often encouraged by colonial governments, which saw opium as a steady stream of income. In some regions, the sale of opium accounted for a third or even half of state revenues. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some colonial rulers were so dependent on opium revenue that they introduced official opium lotteries. Instead of buying a ticket for cash prizes, you bought a ticket that allowed you to purchase opium at a lower price. Imagine today's government holding a raffle where the prize isn't money or a car, but a coupon for a bag of narcotics. Victorian morality meets game show absurdity. You walk through a garden where two men in crisp linen suits sit beneath a parasol, sipping chilled gin brought by a sweating servant. Their conversation drifts easily from cricket scores to profit margins, with barely a pause between. They talk of duty and civilization, yet you notice the discreet slip of paper one passes to the other, a list of tax collections from licensed opium shops. Each number is neat, precise, written in a hand that never once touched a pipe. Historians still argue whether local elites truly believed opium was a social good or whether they simply looked away while counting their cut. Some records suggest certain princes condemned the habit publicly while quietly profiting from it privately. Others appear to have convinced themselves it was inevitable, that if people were determined to smoke, at least someone respectable should collect the revenue. The debate lingers like smoke, half hidden behind those high verandas. You pause at the gate of a wealthy family's compound. A child plays with a hoop in the courtyard, laughing as the servant chases behind. Inside, musicians practice on sitar and flute, the sound floating gently into the night. It feels almost serene, until you remember the rows of bodies outside, the dens, the weary laborers hunched over pipes. The same coin that buys the hoop, the flute, the parasol, was earned by selling haze to men who never had the luxury of leisure. The irony grows sharper when you learn how some elites justified their wealth. One merchant reportedly claimed that opium revenue funded public improvements, roads, schools, hospitals. And technically, he wasn't wrong. The empire did build things with that money, but try telling that to the man collapsed in an alley or the child tugging at his father's sleeve in vain. Public improvements for some, private despair for others. You continue down the avenue, and the mansions multiply. Each one is lit softly, music playing, laughter drifting. You catch glimpses of long dining tables set with porcelain and silver, where the wine is imported and the conversation self-congratulatory. The people inside congratulate themselves on progress, toasting with crystal glasses as if prosperity arrived by virtue rather than by smoke. And yet, even here, you notice small cracks. A servant whispers to another about a master's brother, lost to the dens. A ledger in the corner of a study has a stain that looks suspiciously like spilled lamp oil, perhaps an echo of the very dens that funded the household. For all their distance, the haze has crept this far. It always does. As you walk away, the avenue narrows again, the music fading, the laughter replaced by coughing from the nearby alleys. The opium money may glitter in chandeliers, but it drips back into the streets, where bodies lie waiting for dawn. The wide avenue of chandeliers and polished gates fades behind you, replaced once more by the narrower, dirtier veins of the city. Here the smoke hangs even thicker, drifting low enough that it seems to cling to your skin. You notice figures small enough to slip between adults' legs, street children, barefoot and wiry, their eyes darting with the restless hunger of those who know no steady meal. These are the urchins of the opium streets, and their lives are written in scavenging, stealing, and inhaling more smoke than their lungs ever asked for. They hover near the dens like moths circling lanterns. Some are runners, darting inside to fetch food or water for addicts too weak to rise. Others scavenge scraps from the mats, coins dropped by a clumsy hand, a pouch of tobacco, even a half-burnt pellet of resin still sticky enough to be reheated. You watch one boy slip under the ragged curtain of a den, vanish for half a minute, then reappear with a grin and a stolen belt buckle. He'll trade it later for a heel of bread, or, if he's unlucky, a beating from someone who notices. A mainstream Fact: colonial records are full of references to children who grew up in and around opium quarters, especially in ports like Singapore and Hong Kong. Many became errand boys for den keepers, sweeping floors, cleaning pipes, or carrying messages. Their exposure began so young that secondhand smoke alone was enough to leave them sluggish and addicted before their teens. Quirky tidbit. Some of these children developed odd little games out of what they found. Missionaries wrote of boys who rolled leftover pellets into marbles, flicking them across the dirt until one was claimed as a prize. Imagine children gambling with narcotics like they were toy glass marbles. It sounds absurd, even comical, until you remember what happens when one of them gets the idea to light a match and see what the pellet still holds. You follow one girl, perhaps 10 or 11, her hair tied back with a dirty ribbon. She slips into a den carrying a tin cup of tea, delivers it to a man sprawled on his side, then crouches quietly by the lamp. She doesn't smoke, yet. But she inhales deeply with each curl of smoke, eyes fluttering closed as if savoring something sweet. She is paid with a crust of bread. Tomorrow she'll be back for more, and the haze will creep further into her lungs. Historians still argue whether these children were truly abandoned or whether they were part of extended families simply too poor to keep them fed. Some say the dens swallowed them whole, giving them a twisted kind of home. Others argue that they drifted in and out, surviving as best they could on the margins of empire. The truth may be that no one really wanted to look closely. Neither the authorities, nor the missionaries, nor the merchants who profited from the haze. Everywhere you turn, small figures dart in and out of shadows. A boy clutches a pipe nearly as tall as himself, carrying it carefully to a client. Another rummages through trash outside a den, pulling out a cracked cup with delight, as if it were treasure. A pair of children sit on the curb, kicking their heels against the stones, humming a tune to pass the time while waiting for the next errand. Their voices are thin, almost drowned out by the low murmur of the smokers inside. And sometimes you see worse. A child curled in the corner, asleep not from exhaustion, but from inhaling too much smoke in too small a space. His chest rises shallowly, barely noticeable in the flickering lamplight. No one inside pays him any mind. When you step closer, the den keeper waves you off. He'll wake or he won't, and either way, business continues. The street outside tells its own story. Children chase each other around carts piled with crates, giggling one moment, coughing the next. A few older ones sit with makeshift tools, prying at discarded nails or scraps of wire they can sell for pennies. The haze clings to them all, invisible fingerprints shaping their futures long before they have a chance to choose anything else. You pause and think of how the empire will never write their names. No ledger will mark their earnings, no portrait will capture their faces, yet they are here, in the margins, living out entire childhoods in alleys steeped in smoke. Their laughter rings oddly bright against the sorrow of the streets, like a stubborn candle flame flickering in a room filling with haze. As you walk on, one boy darts past and tugs playfully at your sleeve, grinning before vanishing back into the shadows. You almost smile. Even here, even now, children insist on being children, until the smoke takes that away too. You step past the quick shadows of the children and turn toward another set of buildings, lower, sturdier, with faded signs painted above their doors. These are not dens, though the smell is still familiar. These are apothecaries, dispensaries, and the backrooms of colonial doctors. Here, opium wears a white coat and carries a stethoscope. It isn't whispered about as a vice, but handed across. A counter as medicine. The shelves are lined with bottles, green glass, brown glass, cork, stoppered and neatly labelled. Laudanum sits beside tonics for fever, next to cough syrups sweetened with sugar, all tinged with that same poppy-derived ingredient. In the colonies, opium was as common in the medicine chest as aspirin is today. Mothers dosed crying infants. With it, doctors prescribed it for dysentery, cholera, even toothaches, and every swallow blurred the line between cure and dependency. A mainstream fact, throughout the Victorian era, laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was one of the most widely used medicines prescribed across the empire for both adults and children. In colonial settings, where diseases spread quickly and proper healthcare was scarce, it became almost indispensable. The British even included opium tinctures in official medical supply kits for soldiers and administrators. Quirky tidbit? In some colonies, bottles of children's quiet syrup contained so much opium that they were jokingly nicknamed baby soothers. Parents swore by them because the children slept soundly through the night. Of course, some slept longer than intended. Victorian advertising made it sound wholesome, but really those labels could have read, "For when you need your toddler to stop being a toddler, you watch a doctor prepare a dose. He pours a measure of laudanum into a cup, mixes it with water, and hands it to a laborer, doubled over with cramps. The man drinks eagerly, wincing at the bitterness, but within minutes his face relaxes, his body uncurls. Pain gone, at least for tonight. Tomorrow he'll return for more, not just for the pain, but for the calm that lingers after." Historians still argue whether colonial doctors truly believed in opium's curative power or whether they were complicit in spreading dependency. Some evidence suggests they genuinely thought it was the best medicine available at the time, after. All antibiotics were still decades away. Others argue that they must have noticed the pattern of return patients, the slack faces, the increasing doses. Perhaps they convinced themselves it was the lesser evil, better than letting a man suffer from fever or cholera unchecked. The apothecary itself has its own rhythm, a line of patients outside, some coughing, some limping, some carrying sick children. Inside, jars clink as they're opened, powders measured on brass scales, liquids poured carefully into small cups. The smell is sharp, bitter, tinged with alcohol. You notice a shelf stacked with empty bottles. Customers return them for a few coins back, but many vanish into homes as keepsakes, glass souvenirs of the haze. On the counter sits a ledger of prescriptions, neat columns listing names and dosages. Some entries are crossed out, replaced with larger amounts in later visits. You can trace dependency right there in ink. The doctor doesn't comment, he just writes, measures, dispenses. The Empire's other ledger, its great book of profit, mirrors. This smaller one, each dose another entry in a balance sheet written across continents. Step back into the street and the contrast is sharp. You pass a mother cradling her child, a small bottle tucked in her shawl. She murmurs softly, rocking back and forth, grateful that the syrup quiets the cries. Around the corner, a laborer stumbles from a den, pipe still warm in his hand. Both, the bottle and the pipe, come from the same poppy fields in Bengal, both sanctioned in different ways, both leading to the same haze. And somewhere, a doctor sighs with satisfaction, convinced he's provided relief. Maybe he has, maybe he's simply shifted the pain into tomorrow's column. Either way, the bottles empty quickly, the shelves are refilled, and the smoke and syrup keep flowing together. Your steps carry you past the apothecary's clinking shelves and toward the sea again, where the scent of salt mixes with something heavier, the tang of tar, hemp rope, and wet wood. Here, the Empire's arteries pulse with ships. They lean against the docks like tired giants, their hulls creaking, as if sighing under the weight of cargo. Each crate, each barrel, is a silent confession, opium grown far away, packed tight, and sent across oceans under the flag of commerce. Dock workers move like ants, shoulders bent, loading and unloading in a rhythm so constant it feels almost hypnotic. One crate bears the neat stencil of a trading company, another is disguised with tea leaves on top, another stacked casually beside textiles and spices. But you can almost smell the resin beneath the tarpaulin. Everyone here knows what passes through, even if no one says it aloud. A mainstream fact. The British East India Company was one of the largest organizers of this trade, cultivating opium in Bengal and shipping it primarily to China. Even after the company's monopoly ended in the 1830s, private merchants carried on with government oversight. The revenues from this trade were immense. Some scholars argue they essentially underwrote the entire cost of the Raj in India. Quirky tidbit. The sailors tasked with transporting the cargo often nicknamed their ships dream carriers, not because they were poetic, but because the crates were so carefully guarded that trying to pilfer one was like trying to steal another man's sleep. Sailors joked that if you managed it, you could sell it in port and buy enough beer to Dream without smoke. You pause to watch a crate being pried open, not here for use but for inspection. Inside, bricks of raw opium are pressed tight, each stamped with a seal in wax or cloth, assuring quality. The inspector sniffs, nods, reseals. In a few weeks, these same bricks will be pipes in a den, bottles in a doctor's cabinet, or smuggled through markets where official tariffs don't quite match the paperwork. Historians still argue whether the shipping networks should be considered outright smuggling or regulated trade. After all, customs officials were often paid to look the other way, and entire companies were structured to disguise the movement of narcotics as ordinary commerce. Was this trade technically legal because it was sanctioned, or illegal because everyone knew it flouted moral law? The debate lingers like fog over the water. The port is alive with side stories too. A sailor leans on a coil of rope, singing a shanty in a cracked voice. Another pulls a pipe from his coat and takes a quick draw before returning to work, eyes glazed just enough to soften the ache in his arms. Dockside taverns already buzz with men spending wages earned from lifting crates of poppies, only to numb themselves with drinks and songs before dawn sends them back. You notice the gulls wheeling above, crying out in their shrill, mocking voices. If birds could talk, they'd probably gossip about how empires move their greatest treasures, not gold, not jewels, but sticky brown bricks wrapped in cloth. Even the gulls seem to sense that these crates carry more than cargo. They carry whole destinies, entire cultures bent and reshaped by smoke. A ship's horn moans across the harbour, long and low, vibrating in your chest. Another vessel pushes off, sails unfurling, ropes creaking as the crew scurries about. The crates on board seem to sit heavier than their wood and resin suggest, weighted by the lives they'll touch. You stand for a moment at the edge of the dock, gazing out at the horizon. The sea looks endless, but you know where those ships are. Bound. Shanghai, Canton, Hong Kong, Calcutta, Singapore. Each port another node in a web spun across the world, sticky with profit and grief. The wind carries spray against your face, cool but tinged with the sour sweetness of the cargo. It's almost absurd. Here in the open air, under wide skies and gull cries, you can still taste the faint bitterness of the poppy's resin. The Empire has managed to lace even the sea breeze with smoke. You leave the docks behind, but the image of crates stamped with wax seals follows you as you step into the narrow back streets that lace around the port. These alleys aren't filled with sailors or doctors. They're quieter, murkier, with shadows that stretch too far for the lanterns. Here, the cargo changes hands in ways no ledger records. You found the smugglers, the middlemen, the entrepreneurs of the underworld who thrive in the Empire's blind spots. You pass a group crouched low over a sack. They untie the cords quickly, glance around, and pull free smaller packets wrapped in cloth, ready for market stalls where nobody asks for receipts. These men aren't dock workers, not in any official sense, but they know the rhythms of the port, as well as any ship's captain. If the East India Company once held a monopoly, these fellows hold a kind of street monopoly, the right to bend rules, pay bribes, and ensure the haze reaches even the most hidden corners. A mainstream fact. Despite official regulation, smuggling was rampant across colonial ports. In places like Hong Kong and Singapore, entire economies of side deals flourished, with local merchants disguising opium shipments under false cargo labels. British officials often turned a blind eye, since the trade filled colonial treasuries, whether recorded neatly or not. Quirky tidbit. Some smugglers developed elaborate tricks for concealment, pressing bricks of opium into hollowed-out loaves of bread, tucking small packets inside dried fish, or even sewing them into the lining of their jackets. One especially creative ring used hollow bamboo walking sticks, so traders appeared to stroll innocently through markets while literally carrying their fortunes underarm. Historians still argue whether colonial authorities secretly relied on smuggling as a pressure valve. Official quotas controlled how much opium was sold under government license, but underground flows kept demand satisfied. Was this an accidental allowance of vice, or a deliberate policy disguised as incompetence? You suspect the truth. Lies in the carefully timed winks exchanged at customs checkpoints. You follow the smugglers further into the warren of alleys. Children dart between them, barefoot messengers carrying slips of paper and coins. Women sell tea and soup from stalls that double as cover for meetings. A man sits at a corner, polishing shoes, but you notice his eyes scan every passerby, and you realize he's less cobbler and more lookout. Every part of the scene hums with quiet complicity. The air here smells different, not just of smoke, but of risk. You can sense it in the way people lower their voices when strangers approach, in the sudden silence that falls when a police patrol appears at the far end of the lane. The officers stroll casually, hands on batons, eyes alert, but not too alert. After all, a night's wage can be supplemented with a pocketful of coins from the men they're supposed to arrest. One smuggler passes you with a grin, as though daring you to acknowledge what you've seen. His hands are stained from handling resin, and he walks with a confidence born of knowing the system bends in his favor. If the empire is a machine, he's the loose gear that makes it work more smoothly, even if it rattles noisily in the process. And, in these lanes, humor still lives. A group of men laugh as they recount how one shipment was once disguised as a cargo of soap. When customs officers poked at the bundles, they remarked how soft the soap felt, never noticing the smell beneath. "Cleanest cargo we ever carried," one smuggler chuckles, though you doubt his conscience feels washed at all. Step by step, you realize the underworld isn't just shadow, it's the bloodstream of the trade, running parallel to the official arteries. Crates unloaded in daylight become packets sold in darkness. Licensed dispensaries treat patients in public, while dens thrive down unlit alleys. And through it all, coins pass from hand to hand as silently and steadily as smoke itself curling through the night air. You wander farther inland, away from the shadows of smuggling lanes and the creak of ships, into the neighborhoods where ordinary families live. At first, the streets seem calmer. Children chase hoops, vendors fry cakes in bubbling oil, and women carry baskets heavy with greens. Yet, if you look closely, you notice something more fragile, lingering just beneath the surface. The homes feel thinner, patched together with cheap wood and woven mats, as if entire households are held up by string and willpower alone. Inside many of these rooms, the smoke you've been trailing doesn't drift from chimneys, but from low tables and carefully guarded boxes. Here, opium has crept into domestic life. Fathers, after long shifts hauling crates or stitching sails, light their pipes not in public dens, but in front of their children. Mothers, sometimes urged by aching joints or sleepless nights, join them in smaller doses, telling themselves it's no worse than sipping tea. The haze, so familiar by now, mingles with the smell of rice and broth, making supper taste faintly bitter. A mainstream fact. By the mid-19th century, surveys in places like Hong Kong revealed that entire households were consuming opium. Not always to excess, some used small amounts as pain relief or a social relaxant, but dependency often grew quietly, like ivy climbing a wall, unnoticed until it had overtaken the structure. Quirky tidbit? Colonial records note that some children were given tiny doses dissolved in water to keep them quiet during long workdays. Known as Godfrey's cordial, or mother's friend, these mixtures combined opium with sweeteners. It wasn't unusual for a crying toddler to be lulled to sleep with the same drug that toppled empires. Historians still argue whether families turned to opium primarily out of desperation or cultural adoption. Was it poverty and exhaustion that drove parents to the pipe, or did it become woven into the fabric of daily rituals as common as tea or tobacco? The debate blurs like smoke in a closed room. You step into one household where a mat is spread on the floor. A man leans back, pipe balanced on his lips, while his wife tends to a pot of rice. Their son sits cross-legged, watching with wide eyes. The father exhales a slow ribbon of smoke, and the boy giggles as though his father has just performed a magic trick. There is no sense of shame here, only routine, as ordinary as bread baking. But beneath the laughter, you sense fragility. The man's arms are lean, his movements slower than they should be for his age. The woman's eyes are tired, her hands trembling just slightly as she stirs. You realize that opium doesn't roar into a household, it seeps like water through cracks, changing the texture of everyday life until the foundation feels less steady. Outside, Neighbors trade whispers about which families have pawned their heirlooms to pay for more resin and which children skip school to help with debt. Yet, in the same breath, someone jokes about a neighbor's clumsy pipe technique, comparing him to a rooster trying to whistle. Even in dependence, humor cushions the fall. You walk on, and every doorway seems to tell a similar story. A grandmother nodding off on a stool, a father staring too long at the floor, a teenager slipping into the alley to fetch another packet. The haze clings not just to ceilings, but to the very bonds of kinship, threading its way through marriages, parenting, and inheritance. It is no longer only a commodity traded in crates or smuggled in alleys. It is a house guest in the most private rooms, a quiet occupant of daily life. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that empire did not just shape trade routes and wars. It reshaped kitchens, lullabies, and the rhythm of family evenings. The streets of corpses may lie outside, but the softer, slower unraveling begins here, at the hearth. You move past the narrow homes and deeper into the lanes where whole blocks have been claimed by the haze. These aren't dens hidden behind doors or families smoking quietly by lamplight. These are neighborhoods where every threshold opens to the same scent, where it seems the walls themselves sweat resin. The further you walk, the heavier the air grows, as if the street has become a single sprawling room. You pass a line of shops, though most no longer sell what their signs promise. A tailor's storefront now doubles as a meeting place for pipe sharers. The shelves that once displayed bolts of cloth now support bamboo racks filled with little lamps and trays. Next door, a bakery has been hollowed into a hollow of bodies, men reclining with glazed eyes instead of queuing for bread. Even the barber's stall, with its cracked mirror and rusty scissors, holds a hidden corner where smoke curls toward the rafters. A mainstream fact: colonial cities often saw entire districts transformed by opium. In Singapore's Chinatown or Hong Kong's Taiping Shan, official reports described block after block saturated with dens and dependent households. These districts were not simply dotted with users, they became almost monocultures, their economies and rhythms bent entirely towards supplying and consuming the drug. Quirky tidbit: some landlords charged higher rent for rooms suitable for opium smoking, especially ones with good ventilation or a convenient nook for a lamp. Imagine paying extra just to have the right draft of air to carry your smoke out the window. Property. Speculation, it seems, adapts to every habit. Historians still argue whether these districts formed naturally around shared habit or whether colonial zoning indirectly encouraged them by containing vice to designated Chinese quarters. Was this clustering a spontaneous social gravity or a controlled ghettoization designed to protect European neighborhoods from the smell and sight of dependency? The truth, as usual, seems entangled in both prejudice and economics. The street grows quieter as you move deeper. Children here don't play hoops or chase kites. They linger in doorways, listless, their clothes hanging loose. Women sit in groups, whispering and knitting nets that seem more symbolic than useful. Men drift between rooms like ghosts, greeting each other with faint nods before returning to their mats. You overhear a joke whispered among a group of boys perched on a step. They laugh about how one man once tried to smoke rice husks when he couldn't afford resin, only to cough so hard he fainted into a barrel of fish. "Cheapest high in town," one boy says, though his grin fades quickly into silence. Humor, even in its sharpest form, cannot quite mask the weight pressing on. These blocks. As you walk, the architecture itself seems infected. Roofs sag, wood darkens, shutters hang loose. The haze not only fills lungs but erodes walls, as though smoke has a way of sinking into plaster and weakening beams. The neighborhood creaks under its own exhaustion. And yet, there's still a rhythm, here. Pipes clink against bowls, lamps hiss as oil burns low, neighbors shuffle past each other with quiet recognition. It is a fragile community, bound not by celebration or commerce, but by shared surrender. You realize that this too is a kind of street, just one where corpses are not sudden, but slow, stretched over weeks, months, years, until whole blocks carry the weight of decline. Step by step, you feel the stillness deepen, until even your own breathing feels like it doesn't belong, too quick, too awake, among people who drift like smoke themselves. You walk more softly now, as though not to disturb the quiet unraveling around you. The street you wander into next is quieter still. But here, the silence is not from entire blocks slumped under the same fog. Instead, it is from the steady rhythm of ritual. You see figures bent over small tables, lamps glowing with soft orange light, and the faint metallic clink of thin pipes being set down with practiced grace. If the earlier neighborhoods felt chaotic and crumbling, this place feels like a ceremony repeated endlessly, every motion precise. You notice how carefully the users prepare. A small pellet of opium resin is pinched, kneaded gently between fingers until it warms, then rolled into a tiny ball. The lamp is adjusted just so, its flame steady but not fierce. The smoker bends close, holds the pipe over the flame, and lets the resin soften, bubbling faintly before being drawn in with a long inhalation. The entire gesture seems more like tea service than intoxication. A mainstream fact, this ritual was so consistent across colonies that British observers in the 19th century often described it in obsessive detail, down to the angle of the wrist or the way the pipe bowl had to be tilted. The precision mattered because smoking too quickly wasted resin, and in communities where a few copper coins meant everything, no one wanted to lose even a drop. Quirky tidbit. Some pipes were carved from ivory or elaborately decorated with dragons, phoenixes, or clever little riddles. Wealthier addicts treated their smoking kits like fine jewelry collections, polishing them, commissioning cases, even engraving initials. Imagine curating an entire aesthetic around the very thing hollowing you out. It was like luxury stationery for a collapsing empire. Historians still argue whether the ceremonial aspect was a mark of cultural dignity or a disguise for dependency. Was the ritual about reclaiming control over a destructive habit, or was it a way to romanticize something already consuming lives? The debate circles like the smoke itself, shapeless, never quite settled. You pause beside one smoker who moves with such calm precision it's as though you're watching calligraphy. He adjusts the flame, inhales slowly, holds the breath in silence, and then exhales a narrow ribbon of smoke that curls upward like the stroke of a brush. He doesn't cough or laugh, he simply nods, content, as if each exhale completes a pattern, begun long ago. Around him, others mirror the same motions, so alike you could believe they were following choreography. Children peek in from the doorway, watching the ritual unfold like a lesson. They giggle when someone drops a pellet or when the flame sputters too high, but their eyes linger, absorbing every detail. These gestures, repeated night after night, become heirlooms passed down, not through teaching, but through quiet observation. There's a strange serenity here. Unlike the crumbling districts you passed earlier, this space feels less desperate and more suspended, as though the ceremony itself has given people a rhythm to hold on to. Yet the stillness carries danger too. The men look older than they are. Their fingers tremble even as their gestures remain precise. Their eyes drift shut mid-inhale, not from contentment, but exhaustion. A neighbor leans over to you and murmurs a joke. You can tell a true addict by the way he guards his pipe, like a banker with his gold, only the smoke disappears faster. You chuckle politely, but the truth behind the quip lingers. Every gesture here protects something fleeting, as fragile as the smoke rising into rafters. You realize that what you're witnessing is not simply drug use, but the creation of ritual, where ritual itself is survival. In the collapse of empire and family, in the ruin of whole streets, there is at least one thing that remains predictable. The lamp, the pipe, the inhale, the exhale. In the quiet rhythm of addiction, some find their last sense of order. You move onward and notice that the steady rhythm of pipes and lamps changes when women appear. The spaces that welcomed men with open doors seem suddenly closed to them, while the women are funneled elsewhere, behind shutters, into courtyards, or into narrow dens that seem designed to be invisible. The streets don't say it outright, but you sense the hierarchy. Men drift openly with pipes in hand, while women step softly, avoiding gazes, slipping into hidden corners. Here, tucked behind laundry lines and small tea stalls, you find one such secret den. It doesn't look like much from outside, just another storeroom stacked with jars and mats. But inside, the smoke carries the same resinous sweetness, Only the atmosphere feels heavier, as though these walls must hold twice as many secrets. Women recline on mats with their pipes, whispering in low tones, children curled beside them. They laugh now and then, but the laughter is thin, quickly hushed. A mainstream fact, in Victorian colonial societies, opium use among women was less visible but not less common. Doctors frequently prescribed laudanum, an opium tincture, for menstrual pain, sleeplessness, or hysteria. Records from India and Singapore note that many women became quietly dependent, their addictions hidden under the label of medicine. Public dens, however, were male-dominated spaces, and so women carved out their own clandestine circles. Quirky tidbit? Some women's dens doubled as fortune-telling parlors. Between pipes, they would read palms, cast lots, or interpret dreams. It gave their gatherings an air of mysticism, whether sincere belief or simply a clever cover for neighbors who asked too many questions. Imagine being told your future while your fortune teller slowly drifts into her own smoke. Historians still argue whether women's use of opium was primarily a matter of medical dependence or quiet rebellion. Were they victims of overprescribing, or did some deliberately embrace the hidden dens as rare female-only spaces in a patriarchal world? Scholars lean both ways, and the truth likely lies in countless personal stories lost to time. You watch a woman prepare her pipe with the same precision you saw earlier among men. Her hands are steady, her face serene, yet she glances toward the door every few minutes as though someone might burst in. Another hums softly to a baby at her side, the tune blending with the hiss of the lamp. For her, perhaps, smoke is less about oblivion and more about endurance, the only way to keep rocking that child through nights that stretch endlessly. One woman jokes as she sets down her pipe, "Men spend all their coins on smoke, then blame us for empty kitchens. We do the same, only our smoke costs less." The others chuckle, though the humor cuts both ways. Poverty equalizes few things, but dependency seems to be one of them. As you sit quietly in the corner, you realize how different the atmosphere is. This isn't the swagger of male quarters or the public collapse of entire blocks. This is quiet survival, whispered laughter, lullabies, and secrets. The smoke curls just the same, but it carries with it not only exhaustion, but defiance, an insistence on carving a space where women, if nowhere else, can exhale together. The smoke thins as you press deeper into the maze, and with it comes a faint tinkling of music. At first you think it's some neighbor's lullaby, but then you see a gathering lit by lanterns strung haphazardly between bamboo poles. Here the haze isn't just tolerated, it's celebrated. Performers in bright silk stand at the edge of the crowd, instruments in hand, while opium lamps glow from the low tables scattered across the floor. You've stumbled into one of the entertainment dens, the kind that mixed leisure with intoxication until the two became inseparable. Men and women recline side by side, puffing on pipes between sips of tea, while musicians pluck at lutes and strike gongs with unhurried rhythm. A troupe of dancers sways lazily in tune, their movements graceful yet slowed, as if smoke itself has choreographed the routine. A mainstream fact: in colonial port cities, opium dens often blended with theaters and gambling houses. Reports from Hong Kong, Penang, and Calcutta describe long halls where smoking, music, and games of chance unfolded under the same roof. For authorities, these places blurred the line between vice and commerce, making them difficult to regulate. Close the den, and you shut down a whole evening economy. Quirky tidbit: some performers actually advertised their shows by promising enhanced visions for those who smoked first. Customers swore that the music sounded richer and the stage lights glowed brighter after a few pipes. It was the Victorian version of buying 3D glasses at the cinema, only the glasses happened to shorten your life expectancy. Historians still argue whether these hybrid spaces amplified addiction or whether they softened its edges by surrounding smoke with laughter and music. Were they traps designed to keep users spending endlessly, or were they cultural refugees where immigrants found community? The answer depends, perhaps, on whether you focus on the empty purses or the full voices singing in the haze. You watch as one dancer twirls, her sleeve brushing the lamp's glow, while the crowd exhales in unison, as though her gesture had signaled a cue. Someone at the next table tells a joke about a man so high he bet his sandals in a card game and then walked home barefoot through puddles. The table erupts in laughter, clapping pipes against bowls like percussion. Even you can't help smiling, though your step remains cautious. The atmosphere feels different here. The earlier streets carried desperation, silence, or whispered survival. This den, however, has managed to transmute the same smoke into a collective celebration, at least for now. It feels almost festive, like a carnival running quietly beneath colonial eyes. Yet you know carnivals end, and every laugh you hear carries the weight of knowing dawn will return, coins will run out, and lamps will sputter dry. Still, for this moment, the air thrums with music, smoke, and laughter. You feel yourself breathing slower, not because you've inhaled the resin, but because the entire space seems to pulse at a different rhythm, dreamlike, suspended, and strangely beautiful in its ruin. You leave the music behind, but the echoes still cling to your ears as you find yourself in a street where the performers no longer entertain, but simply endure. Musicians sit cross-legged with their instruments, strings frayed, drums cracked, their hands trembling as they pluck at notes that wobble and fade. Here, smoke isn't an enhancement to art. It's the reason art survives at all. A fiddler leans against the wall, his bow slipping, the melody collapsing into silence until another man nudges him awake. Across the street, a singer hums, her voice husky, worn thin from both the resin and the endless nights. They perform not for applause, not for money, but as if the act of playing keeps them tethered to something real. A mainstream fact. Colonial. Records often mention the opium musicians, entertainers who relied on smoke to maintain long sessions in brothels and tea houses. Pipes allowed them to push past exhaustion, but over time it dulled their skills. British visitors complained of slurred performances, yet locals often tolerated it. The haze was part of the show. Quirky tidbit. Some opium fiddlers tuned their instruments deliberately sharp or flat, claiming it matched the pitch of voices heard in smoke-induced dreams. It gave their music a drifting, otherworldly quality, though sober listeners often described it as like a cat drowning in a barrel. You can almost hear both truths as you stand there, the strange beauty and the absurdity mingling in one thin tune. Historians still argue whether these musicians were victims of opium or whether they chose it knowingly as a tool to sustain impossible working hours. Was smoke an employer's chain or a worker's rebellion against fatigue? The records never quite say, leaving each broken song open to interpretation. You pause at a corner where three men try to play together, each lost in his own tempo. The drummer slaps too slow, the flutist rushes, the fiddler forgets where he is. Yet, in the haze, the crowd around them sways as though it were perfect harmony. A boy claps, laughing, then offers the flutist a coin. The man bows solemnly, as though he has just performed in a grand concert hall. The longer you stand, the more you sense that what survives here isn't really music, it's memory. Each note, no matter how off-key, recalls a world before pipes, became companions. Each song, though fractured, insists that beauty still exists, even when lungs rasp and fingers tremble. You find yourself oddly moved, though you can't decide if it's pity, admiration, or simply the strange pull of ruined art. As you move on, one singer calls after you with a grin. Don't worry, the tune sounds better if you're half asleep. It's meant as a joke, and you laugh, though you realize it might also be advice. Here, the world is softer when blurred. The sound of faltering fiddles fades, replaced by the creak of wooden gates and the low murmur of voices that carry an edge sharper than music. You've entered a quarter where opium smoke is not just an escape or a pastime, it's a currency, a commodity, a battleground. Men linger at corners with eyes darting like crows, exchanging pouches of sticky resin wrapped in oil paper. Their hands quick and discreet. The whole street hums with a different rhythm now, one of tension and suspicion. A mainstream fact. In colonial cities, the opium trade often slipped into the hands of organized groups when governments tried to restrict it. Chinese secret societies in Singapore, Calcutta, and Hong Kong frequently controlled smuggling routes and neighborhood dens, enforcing their monopolies with brutal precision. The British, who legalized opium imports, pretended to frown at the underground side while quietly profiting from the bigger picture. Quirky tidbit. Some smugglers allegedly trained parrots to mimic whistles, using them as warning signals when patrols approached. Imagine walking through a tense alley and hearing a bird shout, "Police coming." Not exactly inconspicuous, but apparently effective enough to scatter a crowd. Historians still argue whether these groups were purely exploitative gangs or whether they also functioned as protective networks for immigrant laborers. Were they mafias draining the poor or parallel governments offering security when colonial authorities ignored entire communities? The debate lingers, shadowy as the alleys themselves. You notice a group huddled around a table, not pipes but dice rattling in bowls. The losers pass coins, then small packets, their debts shifting from silver to smoke. Further along, two men argue in hushed tones, voices tight with menace, until one finally slaps the other, sending a puff of resin dust into the air. Nobody intervenes. In this economy, disputes are as common as spilled ash. The air itself feels different here, heavier, charged. Unlike the women's hidden dens or the entertainers' fumbling songs, this place has no softness. It smells of power, desperation, and quiet violence. One man leans toward you, offering a pipe and muttering, "First puff free." His grin stretches too wide, and you know the hook is sharp. You keep walking, the sound of your footsteps swallowed by the eye, shuffling of dice, the cough of dealers, the distant echo of parrots that may or may not be part of the scheme. The streets of smoke have become streets of schemes, and every lamplit corner flickers with the possibility of profit or ruin. You slip past the gambling dice and the watchful parrots, and the street begins to change again. The smell of resin still lingers, but now it mingles with parchment, ink, and the faint mustiness of ledgers stored too long in damp rooms. You've wandered into the bureaucratic heart of the trade, the zone where smoke transforms into paperwork, and death is measured in tidy columns. Here, clerks sit at heavy wooden desks, quills scratching late into the night, tallying crates unloaded from ships. The scene almost looks respectable, like any other office in the empire, except the figures they're balancing represent pipes filled, lives shortened, and futures mortgaged. Even the lantern light seems sharper here, illuminating not pleasure, but calculation. A mainstream fact. The British colonial governments in places like India and Hong Kong managed opium as a state monopoly. Revenues from opium sales filled imperial coffers so reliably that officials called it the keystone of finance. In some years, opium provided up to 15% of the Raj's revenue, a staggering sum, as though the empire itself were addicted to smoke. Quirky tidbit? Some clerks were rumored to be so bored of the endless ledgers that they doodled smoke clouds in the margins of reports. One surviving ledger in Calcutta supposedly has tiny drawings of reclining men hidden among the numbers, as though even the accountants couldn't resist shading in the haze. Historians still argue whether the bureaucracy fully grasped the devastation behind the numbers. Were they knowingly complicit in fueling addiction, or did the neatness of ledgers insulate them from the misery in the streets? It's a debate that raises the same question still asked of bureaucracies today. When suffering is turned into statistics, does empathy vanish? You notice one clerk rub his temples, dipping his quill with weary precision, before turning to whisper to a colleague about his own brother lost to opium. The other nods grimly, but keeps writing, as though sorrow itself has been converted into a footnote. In this room, grief and revenue share the same ink. The sound of scratching pens fills the air, punctuated by the thud of heavy ledgers closing like coffin lids. Each page is another tally of corpses hidden behind polite language like consumption, rates, and import figures. You realize this is the most chilling space yet, not because of violence or visible death, but because of how ordinary it all feels. As you step away, a clerk mutters something dryly. At least the numbers. Balance. You almost laugh, because in this corner of the empire, balance sheets are the only thing that ever balance at all. The scent of ink and ledgers fades as you wander into another quarter, this one quieter, but no less unsettling. The streets here are lined with neat houses, British-style bungalows with painted shutters, tidy verandas, and servants moving silently through gardens. Yet behind these respectable facades, the haze of smoke curls just as thick as in the dens you left behind. This is where the colonial elites and merchants take their opium, not in crowded alleys or raucous dens, but in polished drawing rooms, with velvet drapes. You imagine yourself stepping into one, porcelain pipes laid out beside silver tea trays, gentlemen reclining in armchairs, their wives gossiping softly as they sip sherry. Everything looks elegant, even refined, until you notice the glaze in their eyes and the subtle tremor in their fingers. A mainstream fact, opium use wasn't confined to the poor. In Victorian colonies, wealthy families often consumed it in medicinal tinctures like laudanum, or smoked discreetly during private gatherings. Some colonial governors were rumoured to enjoy a pipe themselves, though records naturally gloss over such details. Quirky tidbit. Wealthy households sometimes gave small doses of opium syrup to their children, marketed as remedies for teething or fussiness. The bottles carried genteel names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Imagine a nursery where the wails of infants fall silent, not from lullabies, but from a soporific syrup that practically guaranteed a nap. Historians still argue whether these households truly believed opium was harmless in moderation or whether they simply ignored the risks because comfort outweighed caution. Was it ignorance or willful indulgence? The debate remains foggy, like the parlors themselves. As you stroll past one veranda, you glimpse a woman fanning herself, her gown immaculate, her pearls glowing in lamplight. Yet she seems distant, her gaze fixed on nothing, her fan moving slower and slower until it drops into her lap. A servant quietly retrieves it, replacing it with a pipe she accepts without hesitation. It strikes you how different the setting is, yet how identical the haze feels. Whether in crowded alleys or manicured gardens, the smoke levels all distinctions, erasing class lines in its drifting curl. Before you move on, you catch a muffled laugh from inside one bungalow. Better than brandy and cheaper too. The joke hangs in the air, both smug and tragic, proof that the empire's polished mask hides the same hollow eyes as its back alleys. Leaving the manicured bungalows behind, you find yourself drawn to a quieter, darker district. Here, the streets are lined not with shops or parlours, but with stone facades bearing barred windows and creaking wooden doors. You've wandered into the realm of medicine, or at least the Victorian version of it, where opium wears the mask of science. The first building looms with a brass plaque, Colonial Dispensary. Inside, rows of glass jars glint in lamplight, each filled with powders, tinctures, and syrups. The sharp scent of camphor mingles with something sweeter, stickier, laudanum. A doctor in a starched coat carefully pours the red-brown liquid into a vial, muttering instructions about dosage that seem more hopeful than precise. Mainstream fact, laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was one of the most common medicines of the Victorian era. It treated everything from headaches and coughs to diarrhea and female complaints. In colonial outposts, where proper hospitals were rare, laudanum was a universal cure, a cheap, portable, and dangerously addictive. Quirky tidbit. Some pharmacies flavored laudanum with strawberry or orange essence, marketing it like a sweet cordial. A child could sip it without grimacing, which made overdoses tragically common. It was medicine disguised as candy, the deadliest lollipop of the century. Historians still argue whether Victorian doctors genuinely believed opium was a miracle cure or whether they turned a blind eye to its darker effects. Was it optimism rooted in ignorance, or a calculated gamble in places where few alternatives existed? The debate lingers in medical journals, smudged like ink on fading prescriptions. You notice a young soldier limping in, his leg still bandaged, from some frontier skirmish. The doctor hands him a bottle with the same gravity as offering a blessing. "A spoonful every night," he says, though you know the soldier's empty eyes will demand more than spoons soon enough. Further down the hall, you peek into a side room stacked with pamphlets. Household remedies for the tropics. The recipes read like half cookbook, half prayer, with laudanum starring in nearly every line. It seems the empire itself was stitched together with smoke and syrup. Stepping back into the street, you carry the image of glass vials glowing like stained glass in a temple of false salvation. The line between cure and curse blurs until it vanishes altogether, leaving only the soft clink of bottles and the heavy silence of futures sealed with a cork. The clink of laudanum bottles still lingers in your ears as you drift further down the street, where the air feels heavier and the alleys narrower. Here, the gloom seems permanent, and the faces you pass look more like shadows than people. This is the graveyard district, though no headstones mark the earth. The corpses lie where they fell, in doorways, under stairwells, and sometimes propped against walls with pipes still in hand. You tread carefully, though your steps echo softly against cobblestones slick with rain. The silence is broken only by the occasional cough or the rustle of rats slipping between crates. A colonial policeman stands nearby, yawning, barely glancing at a body slumped in the gutter. For him, it's just another tally mark in the invisible ledger, another morning's paperwork. Mainstream fact. In many colonial cities, opium-related deaths became so common that municipal authorities stopped recording them as individual tragedies. Official records might list them blandly as fever, consumption, or natural causes, erasing the haze of smoke that clung to every breath. The scale of death was quietly absorbed into bureaucracy. Quirky tidbit. In Singapore, it was said that stray dogs sometimes dragged away the belongings, or even limbs, of those who died in the street, scavenging without interference. Locals joked grimly that the dogs became tax collectors of the dead. Historians still argue whether these corpses were deliberately ignored to maintain the facade of order, or whether officials truly lacked the resources to respond. Some suggest the empire turned a blind eye because acknowledging the scale of deaths would undermine the very system that funded its rule. As you move, the imagery grows more haunting. A mother rocking gently, cradling an infant that hasn't breathed for hours. Two men slumped against each other as though still sharing a joke, now frozen forever mid-laughter. And yet the street continues as though nothing is amiss. Vendors open their stalls, sweeping around the bodies. Life and death exist side by side, bound by the same haze. A flicker of irony creeps in. Victorians prided themselves on morality, preaching discipline and virtue, while their colonies drowned in opium corpses. It's as though the empire decorated itself with lace while sweeping skeletons under the rug. You pause at a corner where 3 bodies lie in a neat row, their pipes beside them like ritual offerings. Someone has placed a flower on one chest, white, jasmine, still fresh, defiant against decay. For the first time tonight, you feel the weight of silence pressing deeper, the reminder that every corpse once laughed, loved, or dreamed before the smoke claimed them. You drift away from the silent rows of bodies, stepping into a different kind of haze. Not the smoke itself this time, but the fog of rumor, superstition, and whispered tales. Colonial streets were not just lined with corpses. They were thick with ghost stories, each death feeding a folklore that fluttered like paper lanterns in the dark. Locals murmur about spirits that linger where the opium dens once thrived. You picture a narrow alley where, late at night, people swear they hear the hiss of a pipe being lit, though no one is there. A merchant tells you with a nervous laugh that if you follow the smell of sweet smoke in an empty street, you'll never find your way back. Another claims shadows crouch in corners, always waiting, as though the dead refuse to leave their last comfort. Mainstream fact. Across much of Asia, opium became entangled with ritual and superstition. In parts of China and Southeast Asia, pipes were buried with the deceased, believed to help them journey peacefully into the afterlife. Colonial cemeteries occasionally turned up with such offerings, confusing Victorian officials who wrote stiff reports about native eccentricities. Quirky tidbit? In Hong Kong, it was said that cats lingering outside opium dens could see spirits the living could not. People believed these cats grew fat not from scraps, but from feeding on ghostly energy. Whether true or not, the cats always seemed oddly well fed. Historians still argue whether ghost stories around opium deaths were genuine folk belief or subtle acts of resistance, a way for locals to preserve cultural explanations when colonial officials tried to reduce everything to medical terms. Was it spirituality or defiance hidden under myth? You keep walking and notice shrines tucked into corners, small bowls of rice, sticks of incense smouldering, coins laid carefully beside them. Someone is still feeding the dead, still acknowledging them in ways the empire refused. The smoke from incense twists upward, faintly mixing with the memory of opium's haze, as if even spirits crave a final puff before drifting into silence. The street grows quieter. You can almost hear the whisper of a pipe being drawn, not by the living this time, but by shadows who never quite let go. And as you glance back, you half expect to see the corpses rise, not to chase you, but to simply shuffle home, searching for the comfort denied them in life. You step carefully around the shrine smoke, only to find yourself swept into a different kind of haze altogether, the one crafted by writers, poets, and painters who turned opium's tragedies into art. Here, the street feels like a gallery, walls plastered with yellowing broadsheets and dog-eared novels, each page heavy with dreamy despair. The Victorians loved their opium stories. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater floated through parlours and libraries, romanticizing visions and nightmares in equal measure. You imagine some tired colonial officer reading it by candlelight, nodding along as if the terrors and beauties described were his own nightly companions. Later, French writers spun their versions too, draping smoke over their prose like velvet curtains. Even in the colonies, translated pamphlets of opium poetry circulated, passed hand to hand like contraband. Mainstream fact: opium shaped not only medicine and economics, but also literature. Writers from De Quincey to Coleridge drew on their experiences, whether exaggerated or genuine, to give opium a permanent place in the canon of Western imagination. Their works helped turn addiction into a kind of fashionable melancholy. Quirky tidbit: some colonial newspapers even published serialized opium detective stories, in which every crime was somehow solved by clues overheard in a smoky den. They were pulp fiction of the empire, lurid enough to entertain readers, but sanitized enough not to cause alarm. Historians still argue whether these portrayals reflected genuine cultural obsession or simply exploited curiosity. Did writers mirror the reality of addiction, or did they amplify it because audiences couldn't look away from tragedy disguised as art? The line between confession and performance blurs with every page. As you move, murals painted on crumbling walls flicker in lamplight. Visions of dragons, women with glassy eyes, poets reclining on clouds of smoke. They're not propaganda, this time, but echoes of individuals trying to make sense of suffering. A boy reads a cheap booklet under a street lamp, tracing each word with a finger as though he hopes to see himself in its pages. The irony stings. While real corpses lined the streets, readers back in London treated opium as a literary aesthetic. Death was turned into verse, addiction into a parlour game of sympathies. For those who lived it, though, art was less escape and more memorial, a way to keep the smoke from swallowing their stories completely. You pause at a torn poster on a brick wall, a line of poetry scrawled across it in chalk. Dreams are cheaper than bread. No one signed it, but you know whoever wrote it probably didn't last much longer than the chalk itself. Your steps slow now as the gallery of words and chalked poems fades, and you find yourself at the edge of time. The street straightens, stretching out into the present, where history still lingers like a faint scent in the air. It's quieter here. Fewer shadows, fewer corpses, but the echoes refuse to vanish. You glance up at apartment blocks built over, old opium quarters. The walls are fresh paint, but the foundations sit on ashes of smoke. In some Asian cities, you could still stumble into narrow lanes where dens once buzzed, now repurposed as cafes or laundry shops. The past hasn't disappeared. It has simply been remodeled. Mainstream fact: the legacies of opium addiction still shape health policies across Asia today. From methadone clinics to anti-drug education campaigns, governments wrestle with the scars left by colonial-era systems. Even the United Nations traces its modern drug control framework partly to treaties once designed to curb the chaos Britain had helped unleash. quirky tidbit? In some cities, tourists can buy opium bed experiences, hotels that market replica, wooden cots styled after den bunks minus the smoke. It's billed as edgy nostalgia, though locals roll their eyes at foreigners who treat centuries of suffering like quirky decor. Historians still argue whether the colonial opium trade should be remembered as an economic policy mistake or a crime against humanity. Was it simply poor judgment in the name of profit, or was it closer to orchestrated exploitation with generational consequences? Museums wrestle with the framing even today, often settling for carefully neutral placards that leave visitors to decide. You tread further and notice how even modern slang carries echoes. People still joke about being hooked on television shows or addicted to sugar, tossing words casually that once meant a death sentence on cobblestone streets. The past has slipped into everyday language, too softened to sting unless you pause long enough to feel it. The street narrows again, pulling you toward its final bend. In the distance, you think you hear faint laughter, though you can't tell if it comes from children playing somewhere nearby or from echoes carried forward from a century of smoke-filled rooms. Either way, you keep walking, knowing the last corner is near. The final stretch feels less like a street and more like a long exhale. The lamps burn lower, the smoke thinner, the corpses fewer, though you can't shake the sense that they are still with you, stretched out just beyond the glow. It's quieter now, as though history itself has grown tired. You pass along faded plaques nailed to brick, commemorations of trade treaties, dates of uprisings, and dry numbers about tons of opium shipped overseas. The cold steel of empire reduced. Human lives to cargo weights and profit margins, each statistic a shorthand for grief. And yet, you know that behind every digit once lay a body, a family, a ghost on a street just like this one. Mainstream fact: by the early 20th century, the opium trade was finally restricted under the Hague Opium Convention of 1912, marking one of the first international drug control treaties. For the first time, nations formally acknowledged the devastation the drug caused, though enforcement was uneven and profits continued to trickle. Quirky tidbit: in some colonial ports, when dens were shut down, workers found hidden messages etched under the bunks, scratched words in multiple languages, from Cantonese to Urdu, often just names and dates. They read like miniature gravestones, graffiti, carved by people who knew they wouldn't leave the room alive. Historians still argue whether these late reforms were genuine humanitarian efforts or merely convenient public relations as empires rebranded themselves for the 20th century. Was it morality at last, or just another economic calculation dressed in ethics? The debate smolders even now, like an ember refusing to die. And so, as you reach the street's end, you turn back. The shadows of bodies, the flicker of lamps, the drifting smoke, all of it waits there still, preserved in memory. The corpses will not rise, but neither will they vanish. They remain as testimony, a long warning written not in ink but in breath and ash. And now the street grows softer, around you. The sharp cobblestones seem to blur into smooth paths, and the lamplight fades into a warm, steady glow. The smoke no longer suffocates. It becomes a thin mist, curling gently, as though the air itself is finally ready to rest. You slow your pace, listening to the stillness. The whispers you thought you heard earlier are gone. No more clatter of pipes, no more hushed bargaining, no more heavy silence broken by shallow breathing. Instead, there is only the faint hum of night itself, a background rhythm steady enough to lull you forward. The corpses that once lined the alleys are no longer frightening. They seem to have lain back into the ground, folding themselves into memory, their outlines softening until they are little more than silhouettes fading into dusk. They are not chasing you, not clinging to you. They are at rest now, and perhaps so are you. You lean against a wall, warm stone, not cold anymore. The air feels lighter, cleaner, as though centuries of smoke have finally thinned. You breathe in slowly, noticing how calm the world becomes when history lets go of its sharp edges. There is no rush. The street stretches on, but you don't need to walk it anymore. The journey has been enough. You've seen the lamps, the bodies, the shrines, the echoes, the art, the ghosts. And now you can simply let them fade. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let your thoughts drift into softer shapes and allow the last remnants of this long, smoky walk to dissolve into silence. Good night.